Hey class, welcome back. We're still continuing with our 1900s to the 1920s today. And today we are talking about the roaring 20s. And there was lots of changes in the 20s. Yeah. In the 1920s, women had just gotten the right to vote. They felt like they were more free. They started to dress different. They started wearing their hair different. They had all this technology that was going on. They had cars that were starting to be mass produced. They had radio. They started listening to a certain kind of music. That's what we're talking about today is the roaring 20s. And they thought the good times in the 20s, the 1920s, was never going to end. So without further ado, here we go. The roaring 20s, it's a nickname for the 1920s in the United States. And it was a time of hope, prosperity, and cultural change, like I mentioned before. People were spending money. The stock market was going up. People were loving it. They were spending money on entertainment. There was also advances in industry. They allowed the average person to buy goods such as automobiles for the first time, or vehicles, cars for the first time. Like I said, women were newly empowered. They had the right to vote in 1919, which we talked about with women's suffrage. So everything was going great, and these people during the roaring 20s, reason it's called that, they thought these good times were never going to end.
What was it? The roaring 20s is a nickname for the 1920s in the United States. It was a time of hope, prosperity, and cultural change. With the economy and the stock market booming, people were spending money on entertainment and consumer goods. Advances in industry allowed the average person to buy goods such as automobiles for the first time. Women were newly empowered by gaining the right to vote in 1919. Everything seemed like it was going great, and people thought that the good times would never end.
All right. So the end of World War I, we hadn't talked about World War I yet. We're going to go back, and it's going to be a whole separate unit. But the optimism of the early 1920s was largely due to the end of World War I, and that happened in 1918. The United States had been winning the side of the war, then emerged from the war as a major world power when World War I was over, once they joined the war, and we'll get into that because they didn't join World War I at first. It took several different things going on before they did. But once they did, and they came out as one of the winners in World War I, they became a world power. There was confidence in the U.S. government. There's confidence in the ability of the armed forces to protect freedom, and everything was at an all-time high.
End of World War I. The optimism of the early 1920s was largely due to the end of World War I in 1918. The United States had been on the winning side of the war and had emerged from the war as a major world power. Confidence in the U.S. government and the ability of the armed forces to protect freedom was at an all-time high.
All right, so then you had booming industry. And what I mean by industry, you had all these different inventions that was going on. You had the automobile had been invented in the early 1900s, and they were starting to have mass production of automobiles. They had mass production of phonographs, radios, lowered prices. So people were able to get radios, and they were able to communicate and hear what was going on the other side of the world once they got or the other side of the United States. Once they got these radios, everybody was tuned in. You was hearing, they're saying a lot of the same things. All right. For the first time, working class families could buy a car on credit. So all this, people were like, okay, hey, let's spend this money. We've got money to burn. We're gonna do it. Everybody wanted to own a car and radio, and the economy was booming, and it looked like there was no end in sight.
Booming industry. American industry grew rapidly during the 1920s. Mass production of consumer products like automobiles, phonographs, and radios lowered prices and made these products available to the average middle-class family. For the first time, working-class families could buy a car on credit. Everyone wanted to own a car and a radio. The economy was booming, and it looked like there was no end.
All right. Then you had jazz music. There was different type of jazz music, or different type of music that people started listening to. It was jazz. Most jazz was upbeat. Okay, it was very popular during the time. It's called the age of jazz, as a matter of fact. People listened to it on the radios. They heard live jazz bands at dance halls. And one of the most famous forms of entertainment was to go out dancing to jazz music. You had new dances such as the Charleston, the shimmy, the black bottom. All these were brand new dances, and people were just eating it up because they were loving it.
Jazz music. Sometimes Roaring Twenties is also called the Age of Jazz. Jazz music became very popular across the United States. People listened to it on the radio and heard live jazz bands at dance halls. One of the most popular forms of entertainment was to go out dancing to jazz music. New dances included the Charleston, the shimmy, and the black bottom.
All right. And like I said, women's rights was one of these. Okay. Women's rights. They had just gone through women's suffrage in 1919. They got the right to vote. All right. 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, giving women the right to vote in the United States. All right. And many women taking on new jobs during World War I. Okay, they shipped all the men off to war to fight. So these women, they took on their job. They replaced the men. They weren't ready to give up their independence yet. And women began to dress differently. Young women wore shorter skirts. They had short hair. They began to take part in the consumer economy and gain more freedom in this modern culture. The culture started to become modern.
Women's rights. In the 1920s was also a time of newfound independence for women. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, giving women the right to vote in the United States. Also, many women had taken on new jobs during World War I and weren't ready to give up their independence. Women began to dress differently. Young women wore shorter skirts and short hair. Women began to take part in the consumer economy and gain more freedom in modern culture.
All right. So, like I said, you had a cultural change. It signaled a major shift in the culture of the United States. The Roaring Twenties did. All right. You had the invention of the radio. You had movies. You had mass-produced consumer goods. 1920 became a time of mass culture. People throughout the United States listened to the same radio shows, watched the same movies, and bought the same products. All right. All this was across the United States. And it all came together. A lot of it came together because of radio. From one side of the country to the other, many were doing the same things.
Cultural change. The Roaring Twenties signaled a major shift in the culture of the United States. With the invention of radio, movies, and mass-produced consumer goods, the 1920s became a time of mass culture. People throughout the United States listened to the same radio shows, watched the same movies, and bought the same products. People from one side of the country to the other were doing many of the same things.
All right. So these times were good. 1920s were very good. But every good thing is going to come to an end. All right. They had all the optimism and booming economy. People were buying lots of products on credit with money they did not have. All right. That's what I'm saying with credit. All right. The overall debt of the country grew really fast. And people were speculating on the stock market. Stocks value soared, and people thought they were going to go up forever. But on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. And when it crashed, it sent the United States, well, actually, it sent the whole world into a Great Depression. All right. And this day became known on October 29th, 1929, became known as Black Tuesday. And like I said, it signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. And we will talk about that. That's a unit we're going to talk about. We're going to go back, talk about World War I, and then we're going to talk about a whole nother unit on the Great Depression. So, but the ending of the Roaring Twenties happened when the stock market crashed. Okay, and it was called Black Tuesday.
Stock market crash. With all the optimism and the booming economy, people were buying lots of products on credit. The overall debt of the country grew rapidly. At the same time, people were speculating on the stock market. Stock values soared and people thought they would go up forever. However, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. This day is known as Black Tuesday, and it signaled the beginning of the Great Depression.
All right, comprehension questions. When were the Roaring Twenties? They were in A, the 1920s, B, 1720s, or C, the 2020s. They were in A, the 1920s. They were called the Roaring Twenties because of the big cultural change and everything going on It was just fast paced. People were spending money. Okay. They were having a good time. They thought those good times were never going to end. So 1920s.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number two, what war ended right before the start of the Roaring Twenties? Was it A, the Civil War, B, World War I, or C, the Iraq War? It was B, World War I, and we're going to go back and talk more in depth about World War I after we get through with the 1900s to 1920s. World War I, the United States joined World War I. They won the war, and the 1920s began, or the Roaring Twenties began right after that.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number three, what event brought the Roaring Twenties to a halt? What made it stop? It was going, and then all of a sudden it just, okay, what made it stop? Was it A, the stock market crash of 1929, B, booming industry, or C, prohibition? It was A, the stock market crash of 1929.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Stock market fell, and when it did, it sent the whole world, not just the United States, the whole world into a Great Depression. Number four, what style of music became popular during the Roaring Twenties? A, rock music, B, rap music, or C, jazz music? Jazz music became very, very popular during the 1920s. All right. People go out and dance to it. All right. They would go and listen to it. They go dancing. They had new dances invented, the Charleston, the shimmy, all right, all these different things. Jazz music was very, very popular then.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number five, what invention changed the culture? All right. A, laptops, B, radio and movies, or C, trains? It is B, radio and movies. Radio and movies changed the culture because everybody were doing the same things at the same time all across the United States. It was the first time it was like that. It basically, aside from when they did have the trains, it linked the East Coast with the West Coast, okay? Because everybody was listening to the same thing, doing the same type of things, radio and movies.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class, that is all for the Roaring Twenties for this part anyway. We're going to talk more about prohibition tomorrow. We'll talk about prohibition. We're going to probably talk about Charles Lindbergh and his flight around the world. And then we're going to go back into World War I. So, but that is all for right now. I will see you all next time. You all have a very good day.